Welcome, everyone. Again, I'm Joseph Lichterman from the Lenfest Institute. We're so thrilled to have you all here today for this News Philanthropy Network conversation with EdNC and about how they engage donors and supporters across the state of North Carolina. We're really thrilled to have Mebane Rash, who's the editor-in-chief and CEO, and Nation Hahn, the director of growth from EdNC, and I will turn it over to them to share a bit about their work. Bear with me while I share screen and get everything going, but take it away.
Sure. Mebane, you want to give a quick intro of yourself first, and then I'll jump in?
Hey, y'all. I'm Mebane. I tell people on the good days, my job is to support all of the team members at EdNC and doing their best work out on the road. And on the bad days, I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief. And if I fuck up, I get fired. So it's kind of the whole span of those things. It's super big privilege to be with you all. We find this work to be soul fulfilling, and it's been a real privilege to be in service to students across the state, districts and community colleges across our state the last 8 years. And if you follow the news, you know North Carolina is politically hot every single day, and especially when it comes to education. So happy to be with you all today and talk about the approach that we have found that works best for our team and the people who fund us and the folks we serve.
Great, thank you. I wouldn't have had you cursing first on the bingo card. I'm sure I'll come in later with a first word or two. I'm Nation. I'm the head of growth here at EdNC, so I help lead our partnership work, fundraising and development work. But as with any, even though we're not quite a startup anymore, any nimble organization, whatever else needs to be done. And we'll talk to you about a lot of the tasks that needed to be done over the last 8 years. Today, I'm from North Carolina. Mebane and I actually met 10 years ago before we both got started on this crazy journey. I called her ma'am, and she was offended until she realized she was the same age as my biological mother. The plot twist, my biological mother had me when I was like 15, when she was 15 or 16. So it wasn't that big of an age difference. But anyways, we've been friends and colleagues ever since. So yeah, let's talk about democratizing relationships. You'll see you on the road underneath. So this is the way I sign off our weekly newsletter on post-secondary that I lead, but it's kind of part and parcel of who we are and what we are. When we got started in 2014, Mebane and others took to the road, but Mebane in particular had over 100 site visits over the first couple of months before we ever launched, before we ever published a content, before we ever built the website, to ask people, about their information needs, to understand how information moves to and through communities, what information was missing on education, what information that was sort of essential to their participation in civic life was missing. And it guided every aspect of build out, from the way the website was designed to the way we thought about newsletters, to the way we thought about boosting on Facebook and Twitter, our content and actually paying for it to be out in the community, to the types of content we might produce. One of the things that I think is fairly unique about us sort of from the beginning was that we held about 20% of our annual budget for travel and meetings. I think that is still somewhat consistent, although it's maybe slightly lower percentage-wise now, but not by much, even as our budget's grown. And I think that sense of travel became our calling card, particularly in a state where a lot of the newsrooms not only were shrinking, but even if they were not shrinking, or even if they're shrinking in terms of headcount was slow, travel was becoming harder and harder. One newsletter editor told me recently that before he left his parent company, he literally could no longer get approval for his people to leave their metro area to drive across the state even 1 hour or two to cover and report on a story. So we thought it was essential that we travel. Before we dive into a little bit about who we are and which will guide the conversation, we do want y'all to interrupt with questions at any time. We give Mebane a chance to tell you a little bit about our DEI work, just because I think it's relevant to who we are and also where we are now.
So I'm not a journalist, I'm a lawyer, and had a degree in oppression and social change, and had worked for the ACLU, and had tried a lot of things to create the kind of change in the world that I wanted, from class actions to community organizing to public policy research with an independent think tank in North Carolina. And the low wealth school superintendents across North Carolina saved up about $265,000 and wanted to make an investment. They were watching rural newspapers decline, but they saw this kind of emerging space around digital media, online media, and they didn't know who they could trust on Jones Street, which is where our legislature is. They didn't feel like they had a voice in the conversation on education in North Carolina. And no one was going to come to their districts. North Carolina is a very long state. We have 100 counties, and it's quite long from our western point to the eastern Outer Banks. And so they came to me and said, you know, could you build this thing? And they knew that they couldn't continue to fund us and have us cover them. And so it was just angel funding, and Nation will talk a little bit more about the rest of the funding. But it was important to me from the beginning to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion guided how we built the organization, but also everything about the day-to-day of the organization. And you hear these terms in looking at any kind of industry, whether it's news or otherwise: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, extractive practices, all the different things. But there comes this very practical moment when you're building an organization where you have to figure out, like, what does it actually mean in practice? Because humans have to go out into community, do the journalism, come back, publish it. And it has to be done in keeping with these things that we say we believe in. So we decided to do this work over 4 dimensions: the intrapersonal, organizational, community, and systems change. Intrapersonal can look like things like sometimes we support our folks to get equity coaches. It can look like if someone needs a sabbatical because to tend to their family, but that means we get to keep them on as a reporter, then we're going to figure out how to support them to do that. Organizational looks like a lot of things. It does look like how we think about diversity, like, are our numbers right? And that's like, is our team diverse? Is our board diverse? Is our strategic council diverse? But it also looks like we have an unusual board governance structure where our chair rotates every 4 months. And that's because we wanted shared distributed power among those people. And we wanted to make sure that we had Black leaders that knew they were going to get to serve as the chair of our board. It looks like vendor analysis. Who are we spending money with? Community. And community has led us to create a process for an ongoing equity audit month to month. We have a system where in real time we're getting feedback about where we're going, which communities we're serving, who our sources are, which sources we pick, an analysis of our photos, all of those different things. And then systems change, which means that a couple different things. We were part of the first equity project, equity media project in North Carolina. Looks like having a dedicated reporter for issues of equity. It means disproportionate coverage of the 10 counties that are majority Black in North Carolina. It looks like coverage of people in the education, leaders in the education space and organizations with equity agendas, intentional coverage of them. And also being attentive to like other places that have been places, people, or issues that have been underserved. But we have a process for all of that. And the process has been important so that if Nation and I are not there someday, it's DEI and belonging are baked into like all that we do. That's been particularly important in our work with philanthropists to make sure as we do share these relationships that we've worked to build through our reporting, that that's not extractive and that those relationships are two-way relationships with the people and the philanthropists we bring to their communities, but also the other way around. How's that, Nation?
That's great. I'm sure people have lots of questions. We can return to those later. Wanted to share that just because it grounds a lot of us. So how did we get here? And we'll jump sort of into how we democratize relationships. I mean, as Mebane said, she's a lawyer. We hired one journalist, we hired one web developer. We got real lucky on the web developer. She was a former educator. And so she was willing to come in at a much lower price point than market rate at the time, which was helpful for us. We're at 12 plus now. I mean, we have lots of vendors and consultants and contractors who do work with us. We publish perspectives almost every day of the week. So we have plenty of folks from across the state who participate in our content. But we've become among the larger newsrooms in the state, and we are the largest newsroom dedicated to the educational continuum, sort of a single issue news site in the Southeast. And that's something we're really proud of. We started with an audience of 0, as you might guess. And today we're sitting at about 1.2 million audience members annually. And so one of the things that's relevant there is we built a lot of audience infrastructure through the table stakes program and through other efforts, including Media Transformation Challenge and through our own design sprints, which we would be happy to talk to you about, but that's not why we're here today. But that work allowed us to build the infrastructure we needed and an audience playbook that we're super proud of that we'll make sure to drop in the chat that allowed us to grow our content pre-COVID from 250,000 people our first year, our second year, our third year, to about 500,000, to then 900,000 to 1.2 million, 1.1 million when COVID hit. And unlike many news outlets across the country, we actually not only held on to those, but we now grown those to be about 1.2 million to 1.25 million annually. And those folks are coming Monday through Friday. I mean, really, they're coming 7 days a week, but we publish Monday through Friday, 4 to 8 pieces of content a day, and distribute it by 5 newsletters and also by text messaging. And as Mebane said, we started with 240,000-ish in the bank. I think one of the things I would note is, there's lots of nonprofit startups across the country now, and many of them have started a variety of ways. Some have been bootstrapped from the beginning with 1 or 2 people who are largely working as volunteers, and there are a number of those here in North Carolina. Some of the most celebrated started with a handful of wealthy benefactors, private individuals who could inject lots of capital and who could also in turn raise money from lots of wealthy friends. We didn't have those. We also are in a state that had at the time very little journalism funding, right? Knight Foundation has an office in Charlotte, and they had given money to journalism, although primarily in the Charlotte market, but they were as equally likely to donate or to give money to civic engagement efforts and to the arts, et cetera, in Charlotte. This was pre-local news lab, so there was not actually a statewide funding source for journalism at the time. And so we had to start somewhere. Just so y'all know, today we sit here at around 15 million plus raised since that day. And we pull in, depending on the year, anything from 1.8 to 2.4 million-ish, but generally run about a $2.3 million annual budget. So that number obviously continues to grow year over year. And so we basically 10x revenue, right? We'll talk a little bit about how we did that. Part of our sort of fundamental challenge, and I think our fundamental belief, was that we had to build relationships with funders who cared about our issues first. And so we began with a cohort, which was fairly broad and fairly deep, of education funders around the state, and we visited them. Now, in some cases, we had pre-existing relationships. We had met them in other lines of work, and so those doors were open. In other cases, they met with us because folks referred them to us. But we literally went to them and we said, look, we know you care deeply about education. You've shown that in what you've funded over the last 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, or for some of them 50 years. But how about information? Do you care about that? One of our early general operating funders said yes. And in fact, what they viewed us as was an essential archive of all of the things happening in public education in real time in North Carolina. That's great. We met with funders who cared deeply about the fate of rural schools. That was awesome too, right? We met with folks who cared deeply about the work in 1 or 2 or 3 school districts. And in every case, their funding models didn't really work for us. I mean, in the sense that their outputs they asked for, the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes that they were familiar with were things like, how many kids participate in your programs? How many books did you distribute? And that was a challenge, right? I mean, and so we had to talk to them about information architecture. We had to talk to them about our theory of change. We had to talk to them about the way that outcomes look a little different in journalism, that it was about audience and audience growth, and were people consuming our content, that it was about sharing, and were people spreading our content around, were they engaging with it on social platforms, on our site, were they doing something with it? We built an annual impact survey a couple of years in that allowed us to gauge those questions, including, did people change their minds because of the content they read? Did they contact a policymaker? But it was certainly not easy. And it was certainly, but we started with that general premise. If you cared about the issue, okay, great. Now do you care about the information? And generally we found sort of receptive audience for that. Mebane, anything you want to add there?
No, just that it was also just about not picking and choosing where we were going to serve. Serving all 100 counties in North Carolina we knew was important, serving all 58 community colleges, and understanding how information moved county by county was a key part of our distribution strategy that got us, I think, through the pandemic. We stayed on the road during the pandemic, which was another key decision point. We didn't come off the road. We started out meeting with folks and doing the interviews in parking lots of schools and community colleges, and then we realized that schools were continuing to serve developmentally disabled kids and other high at-risk students, and so we focused on those. And then as schools started to go back, we stayed on the road to be in those schools and show how they were opening back up. But we I mean, I visited myself 92 schools during that first part of the pandemic, and our whole team stayed on the road. And I think that was key in terms of connecting with our philanthropists about caring about these issues and about the people and what's been happening to those we serve across North Carolina, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and afterwards.
And a big part of that was, as we remained in relationship with them, was to see opportunities for growth. We launched a platform and a process and a strategy called Reach and See Voices, which I'll touch on briefly, and then jump into the sort of funder relationship piece. We expanded across the continuum. So we started with K-12, we eventually added early childhood, and then later still added community colleges. And then we also added issue-specific verticals, including equity and literacy. And in each case, I mean, these conversations did begin with those who kind of had a prism around, we care about these issues. And then we worked with them to just figure out, like, okay, what does it look like to get information out? Again, touch briefly on Reach. Part of what we're here to talk about today is how we democratized access and democratized relationships. We also thought it was important early on to begin to think about how could we scale up all of these conversations, all of the visits, all of the travel, all of the information that we were gathering, when we only had at the time 6 people, now 12 to 18, depending on how you count, if you include contractors and consultants. That's a lot, but it's not enough for a state of 10 to 11 million folks. In the aftermath of the 2016 election, a lot of philanthropists in North Carolina were kind of looking at themselves like, oh, wow, we completely misunderestimated or misunderstood what our rural regions and rural counties of the state might want or think or know to be true ahead of the election. And it wasn't just with the fact that Trump won the state. I think it was just the way that the legislature shifted dramatically. And so as these funders had conversations, they naturally caught us and they were like, did you see this coming? What was your experience of rural? And we said, yeah, I mean, like, we knew it would be close. Like, we were seeing hand painted signs on the side of barns. We were seeing handmade signs on the side of roads. Like, and we asked them, like, were you listening to Christian talk radio? Were you going to the county fairs? Were you going to the Liver Mush Festival and the barbecue festival? And the answer generally was no. They were sitting in their office. And so what we started talking to the folks about, both other newsrooms, philanthropies, stakeholders, was, what would it look like for the state to have a statewide engagement effort to create dialogue, create two-way conversation around issues? And so we were able to try on a variety of technology that first year. And as we think about Reach, we think of it as a tech, as strategy, and a goal. We used Hearken, we used Ground Source. We used a variety of other tools to try to scale this listening effort. We eventually decided to build our own. And so we built a tool or a set of tools that have over 16 different survey types that allowed you to text with your audience. We had a CRM on the back end. We have a CRM on the back end that allowed you to monitor and sort of measure these relationships, because the truth is relationships are the most important commodity in many ways to newsrooms across the country. As I remind folks often, our competition isn't just other newsrooms. In some cases, it isn't newsrooms at all. In fact, and instead, it's all the ways people choose to spend their time. And we believe pretty deeply that if you're going to convince people to spend their time with you, they have to believe you're listening. They have to have some buy-in and some accountability to your work. They have to have accessibility to your work. And so building on the back end, we kind of ask ourselves this every day: what tools, what approaches could we build that would show both our audience and our non-audience, or just our community members writ large across the state, that they matter, that their voices matter, that their perspective matters, that we care about them. In fact, in time, our internal audience challenge, both for engagement and growth, became how do we reach more people how do we reach all the people who give a damn about education in North Carolina and show them that we give a damn about them? And so that was core to our audience efforts, and it's core to our travel. We go wide with reach. Recently we held a survey on school performance grades and had over 26,000 participants statewide. We also choose at times to go deep. And so we built a tool called the People Session that Yossi's heard me talk about this before, but we think of it as Tinder for journalism. We basically built a survey tool that allowed you to swipe right or swipe left on whether you agreed or disagreed with the statement. And on the back end would allow us to determine areas of consensus and compromise, or areas of broad disagreement. And so in 2019, and we would have done it again had it not been for COVID, we ran a series of engagement efforts across the state to allow people to lift up to lift up their legislative priorities. And then we did it again in 2020, where we brought students inside of this, inside of the debate and inside of the election for state superintendent of public education. And so we used the tool to first look for areas of consensus and areas of disagreement, and to look for priorities amongst students for their next head of education, and then actually held for a virtual town hall, and then actually held an in-person town hall in a rural community in Eastern North Carolina, to where students actually were asking the candidates the questions. And so this tool has been really powerful for us over the last number of years. So let's get to the heart of the matter, which is our relationship with funders and building deeper relationships with funders. I think the through line that you see, whether it's through Reach, which by the way is available for media outlets across the country to use, and in fact has been in use in markets all over the country and here in North Carolina, but whether you see it with Reach, or whether you see it with the way we thought about building our funding streams early on, or you heard the story of how we launched, we thought that democratizing access is essential, and we believe it's essential to create opportunities for us and to create opportunities for the communities that we serve. As we said, travel was our calling card, and as we went out on the road, as we did what we call go and sees, people started wanting to come along, right? And one of our first visits, one of the first communities we went in deeply was Edgecombe County, which is a rural county in Eastern North Carolina. It's about an hour east of Raleigh. It's about an hour and a half east of where I sit in Durham. And it was a community that had sort of school district that had fallen behind. It was a community that had been left behind by sort of the socioeconomic trends. It had one larger city to the north, one larger city to the south. And then, like is what we said, it was about an hour outside of the triangle. But we caught wind that they were doing something pretty remarkable around education, that they were taking big swings and big chances. They were giving young leaders opportunities to be principals. They were bringing global schools to the district. We could go on and on. You can find the story on our website. But we knew they were doing something pretty remarkable. And as we started sharing their story, as we started creating content about what the work that was underway there, more and more people asked if they could go see it for themselves. And so we created a series called 24 Hours In, which basically consists of an opportunity for policymakers and policy shapers and philanthropists to go with us and to consume content in real time. I mean, that's the way I think about it, right? Like we tend to think of content too often as 750 word stories that are created in an inverted pyramid, or podcasts, or short documentaries, or whatever the case may be. And those are all powerful. But we started asking ourselves, like, what would it look like to give people a chance to go see for themselves? And we ran a series of incredible events, both in Edgecombe County and then Madison County. And we had another plan, and then COVID hit. But there were really remarkable outcomes, right? You saw funders come back and fund things they saw there, right? You saw teachers and principals rise up the list for awards. You saw policymakers ask, how can you spread these sort of initiatives broadly? It was all pretty powerful. I mean, I don't know if you want to jump in and share anything about the Edgecombe story, but it's one I know that's near and dear to you.
I don't know if Edgecombe County is in eastern North Carolina, and it is the first African-American led township was founded there, Princeville. And it's a remarkable community, and it's remarkable in a lot of ways. They taught us, one of my favorite things we learned there is they have a way that they introduce each other when they're meeting for the first time, and they ask each other, who are you? And they ask each other, who are you, over and over again for about a minute. So if I was asking Nation, who are you? He might start with, he's a UNC fan. And then he might say that he works at EdNC. And then he might say that he's a brother and he's a son. And those typical things that we say to each other when we're meeting and greeting each other for the first time. But if you ask someone, who are you, over and over again for a minute, by the time you get to the minute, you're saying serious things. And so Nation might share that his wife has passed away, and that she passed away when they were very young, and that's very hard. And immediately you get into these much deeper relationships. And I think it is because they figured out this strategy of connecting at this deep level across this community, that they were able to dream together, like what they wanted for their schools, which had been historically, not performing well. And what they wanted was for student level redesign to shape in the path forward. That's what they did. National called Transcend, and Transcend decided to create a micro school of 30 kids, 8th and 9th graders. And they built a school, and that school then spread to 3 grades, and then it spread to a whole feeder pattern within this district, and now across North Carolina, other districts are looking at what they did there. And it's a remarkable story. We embedded for that first year with those kids. We bought cameras, we taught them how to use them. We created a short documentary about it. But it is one of the most powerful stories that we've come across about how this capacity to connect across difference in relationships can lead to change across a community, across issues like education, really creating very different trajectories for students in the future.
And so you could sort of see this through line of, again, going out, doing the reporting, doing the research, identifying best practices, identifying challenges, identifying opportunities, and then creating opportunities for folks to consume it in real time, right? And the sort of happy little accident from that, and an outcome that we couldn't have predicted, but we're thrilled to see, was that real impact came from it. And not only did real impact come from it in Edgecombe, but you'll see later how much more impact came sort of across the state. But another outcome was that funders and philanthropists started saying, hey, can you create opportunities for us to go and see X, right? They would read an article on the site, they'd read a series of articles on the site, and they're like, we'd love to see how this plays out in real time. And they knew they could create it, but there's certainly a power dynamic at play when they created it. And they knew that we could, or at least believe that we could create, sort of flatten that. right? And so we're the ones who work closest with the community to determine the types of content that should be shown. We're the ones who think about the narrative. We're the ones who create the opportunities to see everything from the local, hole in the wall barbecue place that's very well known, or a herring shack on the banks of the river down in Martin County, or to go into the hollers in Madison and to experience authentic North Carolina in a way they may not otherwise be able to. Part of and one outgrowth of this travel and this opportunity was to, and maybe it was even unexpected for us, was that we saw it as an opportunity to build trust with underserved audiences. And so not only was there this funder play that began to emerge and this ability to take content out in real time, but there was also an opportunity to go out on the road and listen first. And so we've now blitzed, that was our term that we came up with. I don't even remember why. We have 58 community colleges in North Carolina spread across 100 counties. And so when we were funded to launch our community college vertical, the easy solution for us would have been to just cover what was happening at the General Assembly, to go to the state board meetings, to cover sort of the big picture 30,000 foot view of community colleges and leave it at that. But the reality is, if education is undercovered in this country and in journalism, community colleges are even less so, right? I mean, there was one report a few years ago that said that less than 3% of education coverage nationally reference community colleges, right? And this is despite the fact that community colleges way over index for the amount of folks who go to them versus like a four-year school in many states and in many districts or cities. And so it struck us that we needed to meet people where they are, and that we needed to find a way to build trust from the start. And so we went out on the road. We went to all 58 community colleges, and in each one, we held a listening session to understand their information needs. We surveyed them using Reach. We brought funders and policymakers and policy shapers on the road with us. And then last fall, we did it again. But part of that was a request. Part of what followed was the funder, the John M. Belk Endowment, who's led by MC Belk Pylon, who's a philanthropist here in North Carolina, who cared deeply about community colleges, raised their hand and said, hey, we want to go to all 58 too. Can you take us? And the answer very quickly became yes. And so over the last number of years, we've now taken them to 47 of the 58. And these are half-day sort of real-time content opportunities for them to hear and understand the issues that are going on, for us to hear and understand the issues that are going on, for us to surface content is a byproduct of it for sure. We produce content in real time, so we might document what's going on in workforce development in this county. We may document what the president of the college thinks about the budget or what they're doing to change enrollment. It's also a chance for these schools, many of whom would not have an opportunity to present to a statewide funder, to have an honest, open dialogue. We were in a very rural county in northeastern North Carolina yesterday, and there were community members there talking about sort of educational attainment and educational outcomes in the K-12 space, about labor market participation, about what sort of being an aging in place county meant for their social fabric. And they had the new hot business that had just opened up there that was bringing a lot of jobs. And they had the guy who's running that business there to talk about the opportunities and the roadblocks. And A, it was incredible because people there were learning something about their community, but B, it was a chance for this philanthropy to understand, begin to think about, like, what is their strategy for northeastern North Carolina? And it was a chance for my team and I to walk away and say, like, look, there are 15 news story ideas we have now, right? And so it was also servicing content that we may go back and report on later. But there was also just this really candid moment when the president closed the door and looked at everyone and said, here, and she's the new president, here are the 5 things that I'm most concerned about, including safety, right? And that's not, we've been very fortunate in the state to have very few school shootings, but like there hasn't been a community college shooting in 20 plus years until a week ago. And she just walked them through very candidly all of the challenges that she was having with security on campus and how it kept her up at night. And I think it brought it real and brought it home, and it made it real and brought it home in a way that no article or podcast could have done, right? And I think that's the way you begin to change things. You also see here, I mean, this is a quote MC gave us not long ago. We would not be here who we are today without our travels. But I want to draw, and you can read the quote, but I want to draw attention to her last sentence. Most importantly, our travel has shaped every aspect of our work. And so the Belk Endowment any given year gives out north of $14 or $15 million. Yesterday in Halifax County, MC said that virtually every investment they've made to date has been shaped in some way by the travel and the relationships they developed out on the road. And so as we think about the money we've raised, we're very proud of that. But as we think about all of the indirect support that's been generated for communities, for nonprofits, for others doing great work as a result of our travel, we're incredibly proud of that too. Others have followed MC's lead. And so Blue Cross Blue Shield North Carolina contacted us during COVID and said, we want to get out there and see all 100 counties. Will you take us? And we have. And right, this is a photo from the Qualla boundary, which is the home of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. We went there in October. We have traveled and they have traveled together, and this includes their CEO and the president of their foundation to 68 of the counties thus far. They'll go to all 100 counties this year. And just on that tour alone, there's been 2.3 million in indirect donations that have flowed into community. They have connected with nonprofits and with hospitals and with others that they would not otherwise have connected with. I was in the room. We held a conversation, a dialogue about a particular piece of work related to health and human services here in North Carolina and around a particular intervention strategy they're trying. And people lifted up 2 or 3 things that just weren't working. And not only does that give us an opportunity to maybe document that and create content down the road, but the CEO is literally like, I'm going to go call the secretary for DHHS and tell him what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, give him your number. And that's powerful, y'all. I mean, it really is. And it's a great way of both not just creating content, but creating relationships that last. And that benefits us. And it benefits, most importantly, the communities. And so I'm going to give Mebane a chance, and I know we're going to leave time for questions, a chance to tell a story of Canton, which is a very relevant news story for us right now, but also a place where we're sort of stepping in.
So Canton is small town west of Asheville, if you've heard of Asheville, North Carolina, but this is way western North Carolina in the mountains. And it's in Haywood County. And there's a paper mill there that has been there for 4 generations, for over 100 years. It's run by a New Zealand company called Pactive Evergreen. And several weeks ago, word started bubbling among the more than 1,100 mill workers that the mill was closing. And usually when a mill closes in North Carolina, the owners of the mill reach out to the governor first, and then there's a warn notice. And, North Carolina is no stranger to mill closings. We've had that happen before in any number of rural counties, and we know how to do quick response teams and all that kind of stuff. This one just didn't play out that way. For whatever reason, the governor was not notified. The normal folks were not notified. And all of a sudden, it was just workers who were hearing that this was going to happen. And in fact, this mill is going to close. It's going to close on June 9th. And there are 2 papers there, the Mountaineer and the Smoky Mountain Times. They still publish. They publish, I think, weekly. But the biggest problem is Haywood County is so far west that our policymakers don't read those papers. In fact, most of our policymakers don't read the Asheville Citizen Times, which is the biggest paper out there. And so about a week after, there were these rumblings of the mill closing, I started getting calls asking me to be on these phone calls about who was going to cover this story. Because one of the things, and you see in the case studies and books that are written about mill closings, is that what happens is it's in the news at the beginning, and maybe it's in the news the day the smoke dies down and the whistle sounds for the last time. But part of what happens in these communities is that they don't get rebuilt because the momentum of it you know, it stalls out. And so there was this question of, well, who's going to cover this story and who's going to cover it that that has a statewide audience? And, you know, the next day I went out there and met with town leaders, county leaders, met with the head of the community college, met with the local school district. We're having weekly meetings now. Wrote a first story that kind of gave the history of the mill, because a lot of people in North Carolina don't know, they've never heard of Canton. They've never been to Canton. They don't know where Canton is. They don't know the history of this mill. And so we've just, you know, policymakers do read us. We have this kind of interesting audience where we do get read, and we do get read by influencers. And there's a connection to education, because all of those mill workers will be retrained at our community college. It's a very interesting little school district. It has the 7th best academic performance in North Carolina. Very good school district. It also has our very best early college in the whole state, Haywood Early College. And it's an early college that I was embedded in throughout the pandemic to watch how they were iterating their teaching strategies, since they do such an incredible job when they were online and when they were in person, and how they were blending those. So we're there, and our team is there. And, you know, one of the things we realized was in philanthropy, most philanthropists, the folks who've reached out to the people in this town, there's money that will flow into this town, but it'll take a couple weeks or it'll take a couple months. And like, what do they do in the meantime when they need consultants to help them communicate about this stuff, or they need advice about, you know, the school system needs advice about how many kids are they going to lose over the course of the summer? Are they going to have to redo all their school scheduling? And how does a community college overnight shapeshift the courses that it's offering for these mill workers? And so I think just by virtue of being connected to people in other places where they've gone through this, and being connected to philanthropists and being connected to policymakers, there's been a role for us that I wouldn't have guessed in helping to tell the story and keep the drumbeat and the momentum going way out west in North Carolina.
Thank you. And I'm also going to, Mebane, maybe you could end here. I mean, I think one of the relevant pieces of this, in addition to, again, all of the democratized access that we provide and all the opportunities for people to go and see and all the opportunities for people to consume content in real time, was this understanding that philanthropy, in part from sitting in their offices, in part because they don't necessarily have, you know, communications folks, or they haven't thought as proactively about their communication style, or they haven't built relationships, would often call us and say, look, no one's applied for XYZ grant, or we thought people would be really thrilled with this RFP, or we thought we would hear from a lot of diverse communities from across the state, and we haven't. What can we do? And so that's another way we built sort of content as utility, is to sort of lift up these opportunities and to help folks understand, like, there is money out there for their work. And I don't know, Mebane, do you want to share the story of State Employees Credit Union, and then we'll close for questions?
Well, we had a group that we work with, and no one applied for a particular opportunity. And the question was, you know, their question was why? And our question was, well, did anybody know about it? And the answer was no. And so I think there's, you know, I think it's sometimes philanthropists think that just because they post an opportunity on their website, or they push it out into the world by email or social media, people will find out about it. And I think in our experience, it is, yeah, there's a certain group of folks who will find out about it, but it's not all the people that will find out about it. And if you're wanting to really reach, I think, the people that we hope will be more served in the moving forward, it requires understanding that they don't have extra capacity to go figure out that a grant opportunity even exists. It also sometimes might be better for grant opportunities to be able to be fulfilled by video and not a grant application through a portal, or just an interview with someone instead of a grant application through a portal. That sometimes people don't, like, it's not intuitive, the difference between committed funding and pending funding and outputs and outcomes. And, you know, we get a lot of questions about things that I think Nation and I are fairly well versed in, like answering questions, but they're not easy questions for a lot of people across our state. And so just, I think one of the things we've been able to do since we did the 100 county assessment and understand how information moves county by county, and understand who has influence over how that information moves, is that we can make sure that more of the opportunities to access philanthropic wealth across North Carolina is in these communities where we really hope that it'll make a big difference in the moving forward.
I like to end with this quote. I mean, this is an example from a community member who we visited in last fall. And, you know, there's lots of words on the screen, but one of the things I'm most proud of is every once in a while, we are reminded that we're not alone. Your presence, engagement, enthusiasm reminded us this week that we are not alone. And for that, we are immensely grateful. So this came at the end of a 2-day, 4-county swing where we went deep on issues of mental health and lack of hospital beds in rural North Carolina, and what it looks like to rely heavily on Christmas tree farming, and what it looks like for people to be buying up homes for Airbnb and VRBO rentals when people in the area can barely afford to fix up their homes, let alone hold on to them or buy new ones. And it was a deeply emotional 2 days. It created a ton of, you know, content opportunities that we lifted up later. But it also, I think, again, as you can see here, for the folks there, I mean, their feedback was, we are just grateful, all right, that you're here to tell our story, but also that these philanthropists and policymakers were willing to come out and hear directly from us. And so this is one I'm particularly proud of. But with that, we'll draw it to a close and leave some time for questions. We're always around. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on email. We try to be generous with our time. Happy to go into greater detail than we had time for here today, but would love to see your questions. And it looks like there's one that just came in, Mebane, and maybe you could take this one since you're the one who usually has to deal with, thank you, with editorial pressure. But there's a question in the chat you may see. It just says, I'm very curious about whether you've had any instances where taking funders out in the field with you has led to any editorial pressure from the funders to cover a certain thing or a certain way.
No, in fact, I'd say it probably works the other way around. I think that when they see the work that we do out in the field and how we do it, I mean, we get very little pressure from our funders at all. And quite frankly, I think in some ways that's because early on, if people put pressure on me, we would give the money back. And I don't think funders were used to that, but we just knew that we had to make it really clear that this only works if there is a bright line there. And I think being a lawyer helped that way because I was familiar with an ethical practice called the Chinese wall. And so you can come and we'll share these relationships with you, but you have to respect that the real reason we're there is to do the work and to tell these people's stories. And I think the relationships have helped strengthen that respect, if anything. And if there were ever a point in time where that changed, we would use the same kind of relational strategies about, we talk a lot with people we work with out in the field and with our team about harmony, disharmony, and repair, and how well equipped people and teams are to move through those cycles. So we're also pretty quick if we have a funny tummy feeling about something, whether it's happening in the field with regards to reporting or whether it's happening with a policymaker or philanthropist, to name it and say, this is what I'm feeling, and check in and make sure it's real. And move through that harmony, disharmony repair cycle as quickly as possible. But you got to be willing to do that.
Thing I'll add there is, I mean, and she said it perfectly, but we also publish all of our donors on a sort of a transparency page. We have, we publish your normal labels if any funders are referenced in the article, if they fund us as well. We have all of the other policies in place you would expect. So between all of those things, we've been very fortunate. I think there's a question about why you don't choose to request or receive funding from Charlotte Knight Foundation or other journalism related funders. I mean, we, like many, and Meb and I may have different answers here, have spent a lot of time cultivating and reaching out to national funders over the years. I think you would have to ask them why in some cases they haven't funded us or why it's been slow to come. I mean, I think some of it's we're a single issue news site in a single state, right? I mean, another part of it is that it's hard to get funders to fund content, and, you know, there's a million reasons. And then the other part is, I think there's a practical reality that, like, you know, Charles, like many funders, only has X amount of money and has been doing some big swings in Charlotte around a portion of the city that really needed the support, and, you know, has been funding the journalism collaborative down there and other things. I don't know if Mebane, if you wanted to add anything there as well.
Just that we have really close working relationship with Charles. And in fact, I mean, he has, some of the folks that he's funded in Charlotte have gone on to be really important in our work and understanding how to really build deep ties within different communities. I think the Charlotte money he's investing what wasn't for kind of the statewide work we were doing. So it wasn't like his pot of money was going to be open to us. And, you know, I remember early on we had Rolf Neal, who was my mentor, and had, I think, been on the board, and some others reached out to see if there was interest, but it was at the time where you couldn't see us and touch us and no one knew like what we were going to do. And I think it was at that moment where we were just making people nervous. So it might be different if we had ever circled back about that, but I actually don't know that we did. Our dream right now would be that they would make an investment in Reach NC Voices. We'd love to do another round of investment in the code and the tech stack of that platform, and continue to work to take it to more newsrooms around the country. I mean, I think as we head into the next 2 years politically across this country, like, it is really important for us as newsrooms to be in deep relationship with people and understand what they're thinking and understand what access to information they have and they don't have. And I think these tools are just super important.
One of the things, I think that's fascinating. Thank you for that. And one of the things I'm interested in is, I think it's so interesting that you're taking funders and introducing them to folks in communities who could potentially be recipients of that funding, I would imagine. And do you ever feel like you're in competition with the people you're introducing them to? That was the answer I expected, but would be curious to hear more about how you think about that, especially given that I imagine many of these places have limited resources.
Yeah, no, you know, I think Nation and I are pretty zen about, like, we're going to do this work for as long as we can do this work, and then we're not. But we're going to do the best work we can do, and that means sharing resources. It doesn't mean keeping these relationships to ourselves. It means, you know, opening them up. And the biggest grant that I've gotten in the 8 years for doing this job was not for us. And to me, it tells the story of, like, why this is so important. It was a philanthropy was going to make a huge investment in a medical provider to provide mental health services by telepsychiatry to students all across North Carolina. And they called me because they didn't know, and the person who the grantee didn't know, like, where this had been piloted all across the state. And so they asked me to work on this grant and to, like, thread together the story of everywhere this had been piloted, but also who were all the funders who had made investments in this to date, to make sure that those investments, if they decided to make a big bet on this, would be aligned and everybody would feel good about it moving forward. that's the biggest grant I've gotten in the last 8 years. A ton of kids across North Carolina have access to mental health services via telepsychiatry because of that grant. It would have taken us probably 5 years of reporting to get the same investment from our General Assembly to do that. And yet it could take 2 months of my time to like go do this research, thread together, you know, these pilots, thread together the funding and get this grant funded. And so it's just like, what's actually going to move the needle? And then let's go do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we operate from a we don't need to be around forever mindset. And David, this goes back to your question about, you know, what's the range of funding requests and endowments. I mean, we typically now, I mean, I think obviously we don't turn money away. We have traditionally, early on, we were doing a lot of 10 and 15 and $25,000 grants. And frankly, some of those became more work than they were worth. And we still do some of those, but we tend to be anywhere from, I mean, I don't know, what would you say, maybe anywhere from 50,000, some in the low hundreds. And then we have a couple of funders who are more than that coming in annually. We don't really have an endowment per se. Mebane's very good about doing what she calls carryover, like literally carrying money over year, so that we, you know, aren't starting at zero come July 1 when our new fiscal year starts. And I think generally we've tried to carry between $900,000 and $1 million over from one fiscal year to the next. But yeah, we don't have an endowment per se, although we're in a pretty good cash position. And yeah, if we got a business one day, we got a business one day, and that's fine too.
Most of our grants are around $135,000 a year. And part of the key in getting those has been multi-year grants from those funders. Part of the key has been getting them to agree to allow us to use that money for all the things that it requires to operate a newsroom, so that they understand it's not just paying for like a reporter, but it pays for, you know, all of the multimedia support and editorial support. And then we tell everybody it costs us about a third of the money to produce a story is going and getting the story. A third of it is creating it and publishing it. And then the third of it is distribution. Like, it's not done when you push publish. You have to actually like go out and then like out into the world. And so they have a piece of it too. Getting everybody to understand that has been a key part, I think, of our sustainability. And then we have opted for longer runway, but not having an endowment. So we try to have about 9 months of runway at any given point in time versus having an endowment. And we'll see how that works out over time. We don't see a way to build an endowment in North Carolina and have operating cash.
Terrific. I think we are just at the top of the hour, so I think we will leave it there. Mebane Nation, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. I know I learned a ton, and we're so beyond grateful for your sharing your time and expertise and insight with us. So thank you so much. We'll share the recording and slides and some links to resources back with everyone. It'll probably be Friday or earlier next week. I have jury duty tomorrow, so I will be offline most of the day. But thank you so much, everyone. This was excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you all. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.